The billionaire passed the old janitor every single night for 3 years, never realizing she was the woman who gave him life. The 37th floor of Coal Dynamics was almost silent at 1:48 a.m., the kind of silence that only existed after ambition had exhausted itself for the day. The city outside still glowed through the massive glass windows, Manhattan flickering gold beneath the rain, but inside the executive floor, the lights had dimmed to a cold blue haze. Ethan Cole stepped out of the boardroom with his tie loosened and exhaustion carved deep into his face. Billion-dollar meetings always ended the same way. Empty coffee cups, forced handshakes, people pretending they respected each other while calculating who to destroy next. He walked past the reception area without looking up from his phone, his polished Italian shoes tapping sharply against the marble floor. Behind him, two assistants hurried toward the elevators carrying stacks of contracts, whispering nervously about overseas investors. Ethan barely heard them. His mind was somewhere else entirely. Another article had gone viral that night. The coldest billionaire in America. He hated headlines like that. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. At the far end of the hallway, an older woman pushed a gray janitor cart slowly beneath the dim lights. Her faded blue uniform hung loosely on her thin frame, and a pair of yellow rubber gloves rested inside the cleaning bucket beside neatly folded towels. Margaret Cole always waited until everyone left before cleaning the executive floor. Less attention that way, less risk. Her silver-streaked hair was tied back carefully, though loose strands still framed her tired eyes. She looked up the moment she heard Ethan's footsteps approaching, the same way she always did. Quietly, carefully, like someone memorizing a miracle from a distance. Ethan walked past her without slowing down. He had seen her hundreds of times before, maybe thousands. To him, she was just part of the building. Another quiet face among security guards, receptionists, and maintenance workers. But tonight, something small happened. Ethan loosened his tie while walking, frustrated after the meeting, and the silk folded awkwardly beneath his collar. Margaret's eyes softened instantly. Before she could stop herself, she stepped forward gently. "Here," she whispered. Ethan stopped. The old woman adjusted his tie with trembling fingers, smoothing the knot instinctively. The movement was small, natural, familiar, too familiar. Ethan froze. For one strange second, the hallway disappeared. He suddenly remembered being 8 years old, standing on a wooden stool before school, while his mother fixed his crooked tie in the kitchen mirror. "Hold still, baby," she used to whisper softly. His chest tightened unexpectedly. Margaret realized what she had done and quickly stepped back, lowering her eyes. "Sorry, Mr. Cole," she said quietly. It was crooked. Ethan stared at her longer than usual. Her voice carried something strange inside it. Warmth. Memory. He couldn't explain why his heartbeat suddenly felt uneven. "Do I know you?" he asked slowly. Margaret's fingers tightened around the cleaning cloth in her hand. For a second, her eyes shimmered beneath the fluorescent lights. Then she forced a tiny smile. "No, sir," she answered. "Just an old janitor." Ethan nodded once, though something about the answer felt wrong. He turned and continued walking toward his office, but halfway there, he stopped again. Behind him, the old woman was quietly wiping rainwater from the marble floor where his shoes had tracked it in. Slow circles, careful movements, like she had all the time in the world just to clean up after him. Ethan watched silently for a moment longer before disappearing into his office. Margaret waited until the door closed completely. Only then did her composure crack. Her hand trembled against the mop handle as tears gathered silently in her eyes. 3 years. 3 entire years working just feet away from her son, and he still didn't recognize her. But what hurt the most was that part of her believed he never would. Ethan Cole had not slept properly in almost 11 years. Most people assumed billionaires lived easy lives filled with champagne parties, luxury vacations, and private islands somewhere in the Caribbean. They never saw the reality. The silence inside a 12,000-square-foot penthouse at 3 in the morning. The untouched dining table. The city lights reflecting against floor-to-ceiling windows while no one waited for you to come home. Ethan stepped into his penthouse just after 2:30 a.m., loosening his coat as rain tapped softly against the glass walls overlooking Manhattan. The apartment was spotless, cold, expensive, and completely lifeless. Modern art covered the walls. A marble fireplace stretched across the living room. Everything looked perfect. Nothing felt warm. He tossed his phone onto the kitchen island, but it immediately buzzed again. Another business email. Another investor issue. Another problem demanding his attention before sunrise. Ethan ignored it this time. He walked toward the bar and poured himself a glass of sparkling water instead. His reflection stared back at him through the dark window. 38 years old. One of the youngest billionaires in America. Featured on magazine covers. Interviewed by every major network. Yet somehow, every night still ended the same way. Alone. He loosened his tie again, suddenly remembering the old janitor's hands from earlier that night. The way she had fixed it so naturally. So carefully. Ethan frowned slightly. Why did that bother him so much? He could not explain it. He moved toward the hallway near his office and unlocked a small black safe hidden behind a framed photograph. Inside sat stacks of confidential documents, expensive watches, and at the very bottom, one faded childhood picture. Ethan stared at it silently. A small boy stood beside a woman with bright eyes and soft blonde hair outside a tiny apartment building in Brooklyn. The edges of the photo were worn from years of handling. He rarely looked at it for long. "You left," he muttered quietly beneath his breath. "You chose money over me." That was the story he had repeated to himself since childhood. His mother abandoned him when he was 8 years old. At least that was what his father told him over and over again until Ethan eventually stopped questioning it. She disappeared. Never called. Never wrote. Never came back. And after enough years, anger became easier than grief. Ethan shoved the photo back into the safe quickly, almost irritated at himself for even touching it. Across the city, inside a tiny one-bedroom apartment above an old laundromat in Queens, Margaret sat quietly near the window with a cup of tea cooling between her hands. Rainwater rolled slowly down the glass, while an old jazz station played softly from a small radio nearby. Her apartment smelled faintly like lavender detergent and lemon cleaner from her work uniform hanging beside the door. On the kitchen table sat dozens of carefully clipped newspaper articles about Ethan. Forbes covers, charity galas, business awards, magazine interviews. Every accomplishment of his life, preserved neatly like sacred memories. Margaret picked up the newest article with trembling fingers. "The billionaire who trusts nobody." Her eyes softened painfully. "You were never like that as a little boy," she whispered. Beside the newspaper sat a small velvet box. Margaret opened it slowly. Inside was a tiny silver tie clip shaped like a star. Ethan's favorite when he was a child. He used to call it his lucky star before every school presentation. Margaret smiled faintly through wet eyes. Then her smile slowly disappeared. Earlier that night, when she fixed Ethan's tie, for one dangerous second, she almost forgot herself. Almost forgot the rules she had spent 3 years building around her heart. Stay quiet. Stay invisible. Just seeing him alive was enough. That was what she told herself every single day. But tonight something had changed. Because for the very first time in years, Ethan had looked directly at her. The next few days unsettled Ethan in ways he could not explain. He began noticing things that had always been there, but somehow invisible before. Every morning, his office was perfectly organized before he arrived. Not in the stiff, corporate way his assistants usually arranged things, but carefully. Personally, his coffee mug always sat on the warmer before sunrise. His reading glasses were folded exactly where his hand naturally reached for them. Even the small stress headaches he got during late meetings somehow seemed anticipated. One Thursday morning, Ethan walked into his office and stopped immediately. A small bottle of aspirin sat beside his laptop with a handwritten note underneath. "You forgot lunch yesterday. Please eat something today." No signature. No explanation. Just neat cursive handwriting on plain white paper. Ethan stared at the note for several seconds. Nobody in the company spoke to him that way. Employees feared him too much. Executives only approached him when they needed approval or money. Yet somehow this simple sentence irritated him more than any boardroom argument. Because it sounded caring, personal, almost maternal. He picked up the note again later that afternoon during a conference call with investors from Chicago. While the executives argued numbers through the speakerphone, Ethan found himself tracing the edges of the paper absent-mindedly. His mind drifted unexpectedly toward childhood memories he had spent years trying to bury. His mother cutting apples into small slices because he hated biting them whole. Her placing medicine beside his bed during winter fevers. Her voice humming softly while folding laundry in their tiny Brooklyn apartment. Ethan suddenly shoved the note into his desk drawer and focused back on the meeting. "Double the expansion budget," he said coldly into the phone. "I do not care what it costs." But even his own voice sounded distant to him now. That same night, rain hammered against Manhattan harder than before. The executive floor emptied earlier than usual after a difficult press conference regarding a collapsing merger deal overseas. Tension hung heavy throughout the building. Ethan remained inside his office long after midnight, staring at spreadsheets glowing across multiple monitors. His eyes burned from exhaustion. The pressure in his chest had been building all day. Investor panic. Lawsuits. Media speculation. Another article accusing him of destroying smaller companies for profit. By 1:15 a.m., Ethan finally rubbed his face and stood from his desk, only for dizziness to hit him unexpectedly. He grabbed the edge of the table as his breathing turned uneven. Slow at first, then faster. The walls suddenly felt too close. His chest tightened painfully. He tried inhaling deeper, but the air would not come properly. Panic attacks were not new to Ethan. He simply never allowed anyone to see them. He loosened his collar sharply and stumbled toward the glass windows, gripping the frame beside them. Below him, New York blurred into streaks of gold and rainwater. His breathing became worse. Fast, shallow, uncontrolled. "Mr. Cole," a soft voice whispered behind him. Ethan turned slightly. Margaret stood near the doorway holding a folded cleaning towel against her chest. Her worried eyes widened instantly the moment she saw his face. "I am fine," Ethan snapped automatically, though he clearly was not. Margaret ignored the sharpness in his tone. She moved closer slowly, carefully, like approaching a frightened animal. "You need to breathe first," she said gently. "Then think later." Ethan froze. The sentence hit him harder than the panic itself, because those exact words had lived somewhere deep in his memory for decades. His mother used to whisper them whenever thunderstorms scared him as a child. Margaret guided him carefully toward the leather couch near the fireplace. She handed him a glass of water with slightly trembling hands. "Slow breaths," she said softly. "Just look at one thing in the room. Nothing else." Ethan stared at her silently while trying to steady his breathing. The old janitor sat quietly beside him, not asking questions, not judging him, not staring at him like a billionaire or a headline, just waiting patiently until the storm inside him passed. For the first time in years, Ethan realized something terrifying. He felt safer beside this stranger than almost anyone else in his entire life. Rain continued falling over Manhattan long after the panic attack ended, turning the city lights beyond the windows into soft streaks of gold and silver. Ethan sat quietly on the leather couch with his elbows resting on his knees, trying to regain control of his breathing while the old janitor folded a towel carefully beside the coffee table. Neither of them spoke for almost a full minute. The silence felt strange, not awkward, just unfamiliar. Ethan was used to silence filled with tension. Silence inside boardrooms. Silence before negotiations. Silence where everyone wanted something from him. But this felt different. Softer somehow. Margaret finally handed him another glass of water. "You should eat before drinking coffee all day," she said gently. Ethan looked up sharply. "How do you know I only drank coffee today?" Margaret immediately realized her mistake. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the towel. "I clean your office," she answered quietly. "Most days your lunch comes back untouched." Ethan leaned back slowly, studying her face more carefully now. The lines around her eyes. The softness in her voice. The way she avoided direct attention like someone trained to disappear. "You notice a lot for a janitor," he said. Margaret smiled faintly. "People who clean up after others usually do." Something about that answer lingered heavily in the room. Ethan loosened his tie completely this time and looked toward the rain outside the windows. "I hate storms," he admitted unexpectedly. The confession surprised even him. Margaret's eyes softened immediately. "You always did." Ethan turned toward her so fast the movement startled them both. Margaret's breath caught. The words had slipped out before she could stop them. A dangerous mistake. Ethan stared at her carefully now, suspicion slowly replacing exhaustion. "What did you say?" Margaret forced herself to stay calm. "I said most people do," she corrected softly, though the lie sounded fragile even to her own ears. Ethan kept watching her another few seconds before finally looking away again. But something had changed. A question had entered the room now, quiet and heavy. Margaret stood slowly and reached for the cleaning cart. "You should go home, Mr. Cole," she whispered. "It is almost 2 in the morning." Ethan nodded absent-mindedly, but instead of standing, he suddenly asked, "How long have you worked here?" Margaret paused beside the doorway. 3 years. Ethan frowned slightly. And before that? Margaret hesitated. Different places. Ethan noticed the hesitation immediately. Billionaires learned to read people for survival. Investors lied. Executives hid motives. Employees concealed resentment. He could recognize guarded answers instantly. Yet strangely, he did not feel threatened by this woman. Just curious. "You have family?" he asked quietly. Margaret lowered her eyes toward the floor. "I had a son once." Ethan's chest tightened unexpectedly. "What happened?" Margaret swallowed carefully before answering. "Life happened." Her voice almost broke on the last word. Ethan looked down at his hands, suddenly unsure why this conversation mattered so much to him. The old janitor should have meant nothing. Yet every time she spoke, fragments of buried memories stirred somewhere deep inside him. Small things. Forgotten things. The smell of laundry soap. Warm soup during winter storms. Someone humming softly while he fell asleep as a child. Margaret turned to leave before her emotions betrayed her completely. But just as she reached the door, Ethan spoke again. "Wait." She stopped instantly. Ethan stood slowly from the couch and walked toward his desk. He opened a small drawer, pulled out a business card, and held it toward her. "If you ever need anything," he said quietly, "medical help, money, anything at all, call this number directly. My private line." Margaret stared at the card in his hand without moving. Tears burned behind her eyes so quickly she almost lost composure entirely. Because after 30 years apart, this was the first thing her son had willingly given her. For the next several days, Ethan found himself looking for her without meaning to. It started with small things. His eyes drifting toward the end of the hallway during late meetings. His attention catching the quiet sound of wheels rolling across marble floors after midnight. The faint scent of lemon cleaner lingering outside his office somehow became strangely comforting. He hated admitting it, even to himself. But the executive floor no longer felt as empty when the old janitor was nearby. Thursday night arrived wrapped in cold rain and heavy fog drifting between Manhattan skyscrapers. Ethan remained trapped inside back-to-back negotiations with overseas partners until nearly midnight. By the time the last executive left, his head pounded sharply behind his eyes. He loosened his collar while walking toward the break room, exhausted enough to finally ignore the image of perfection everyone expected from him. As he approached the corner hallway, he noticed a soft light glowing beneath the small employee kitchen doorway. Margaret sat alone near the counter with a paper cup of tea warming her hands. The overhead light cast a soft golden glow across her silver hair while rain tapped quietly against the nearby windows. She looked peaceful there. Human, not invisible. Ethan stopped in the doorway without speaking. Margaret glanced up, visibly startled to see him. "Mr. Cole," she said softly as she began standing immediately. Ethan raised a hand slightly. "You do not have to get up every time I walk into a room." Margaret gave a small embarrassed smile and slowly sat back down. Ethan surprised himself by taking the chair across from her instead of leaving. For a moment neither of them spoke. The coffee machine hummed softly nearby, while distant thunder rolled across the city outside. Ethan rubbed his temple tiredly. "You ever feel like everyone wants something from you?" he asked suddenly. Margaret studied him quietly before answering. "Every lonely person feels that way eventually." Ethan gave a dry laugh beneath his breath. "You think I am lonely?" Margaret looked at him carefully. "I think tired people usually are." Ethan stared down into his untouched coffee cup. It amazed him how easily she spoke to him. No fear. No performance. No fake admiration because of his money. Just honesty. Simple and direct. He realized he had not experienced that in years. Margaret slowly reached into her bag and placed a small wrapped sandwich beside him. "Turkey and cheese," she said gently. "You skipped dinner again." Ethan looked at the sandwich, then at her. "You really pay attention to everything." Margaret's expression softened. Some people are easier to worry about than others. Ethan should have walked away. Instead, he opened the sandwich quietly and took a bite. Warmth spread through him almost instantly. Not because of the food itself, but because someone had prepared it for him. The feeling hit him harder than expected. Across the table, Margaret watched him carefully while pretending to sip her tea. Her eyes carried the same silent tenderness they always had when Ethan was little and came home exhausted from school. Ethan suddenly noticed a faint melody humming beneath her breath. Soft, slow, familiar. His hand froze halfway toward the sandwich. "What song is that?" he asked quietly. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. She had not even realized she was humming. "Just an old lullaby," she answered quickly. But Ethan kept staring at her now, because somewhere deep inside his memory, beneath years of anger and distance, he recognized it. A melody drifting through a tiny apartment during thunderstorms. A warm blanket tucked around his shoulders. A woman kissing his forehead while singing softly beside his bed. Ethan slowly lowered the sandwich onto the table. "My mother used to sing that," he whispered. Margaret looked down instantly, hiding the tears already forming in her eyes. "It is a beautiful song," she managed softly. Ethan could not explain why his chest suddenly felt tight again, or why, for the first time in decades, he desperately wanted to remember his mother's face. After that night in the employee kitchen, Ethan stopped pretending the old janitor meant nothing to him. Something inside him had shifted quietly, like a locked door beginning to open after years rusted shut. He found himself staying later at the office now, though for the first time it was not entirely because of work. Sometimes he caught himself listening for the faint sound of her cart wheels moving through the hallway. Other times he noticed details that should have been impossible. She always knew when his migraines were starting before he said a word. She replaced burned-out lights near his office before maintenance tickets were filed. Somehow his favorite black coffee appeared on difficult mornings without him ordering it. One evening, Ethan arrived unusually early before a board dinner and stopped outside his office door. Inside, Margaret stood near his bookshelf adjusting a crooked framed photograph from one of his charity events. She smiled softly at the picture before realizing he was there. Her expression changed instantly. "Sorry," she whispered, stepping back. It was tilted. Ethan remained leaning against the doorway, watching her quietly. "You act like this place belongs to you," he said. Margaret lowered her eyes quickly. "No, sir," she answered gently. "Just trying to take care of it." Ethan studied her face another moment. Then something caught his attention near the top shelf behind her. A tiny silver object rested partially hidden beside several business awards. Ethan frowned slightly and walked closer. "What is that?" Margaret's face immediately lost color. "Nothing," she said too quickly. But Ethan had already reached past her and picked it up carefully. A small silver tie clip shaped like a star. His breathing stopped. The world around him seemed to fade beneath the fluorescent office lights. He knew this tie clip. Every scratch. Every edge. "Where did you get this?" he asked slowly. Margaret's hands trembled visibly now. "I found it years ago," she whispered. Ethan stared at the tiny silver star resting in his palm. His mother gave him that clip before his third-grade school recital because he was terrified to stand on stage. He remembered crying in the hallway while she fixed the clip onto his tiny blue tie. "Lucky stars protect brave boys," she had whispered back then. Ethan suddenly looked up at Margaret, confusion flooding his face. "This belonged to me." Margaret's eyes filled instantly. She opened her mouth to answer, but stopped herself. Years of silence chained her words in place. Ethan stepped closer slowly. "How do you have this?" Before Margaret could respond, the sharp sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. Victor Hale appeared carrying a stack of contracts beneath his arm. The moment he saw Ethan standing beside the janitor, his expression darkened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Cole," Victor said smoothly. "The investors from Boston are waiting downstairs." Ethan barely looked at him. "Do you know her?" he asked suddenly. Victor's eyes flicked briefly toward Margaret. Something cold passed through them before he forced a professional smile. "The cleaning staff rotates often," he answered calmly. "I do not keep track." Margaret lowered her head immediately, gripping the cleaning cart tighter. Ethan noticed the fear flash across her face the moment Victor arrived. Real fear. Not nervousness. Not embarrassment. Fear. Victor stepped closer, his voice remaining smooth and controlled. "The gala schedule still needs your approval tonight." Ethan slowly slipped the silver star tie clip into his pocket without taking his eyes off Margaret. "We will finish this conversation later," he said quietly to her. Margaret forced herself to nod. But after Ethan finally walked away with Victor, her knees weakened so badly she had to grip the edge of the cart to remain standing. Because for the first time in 30 years, her son was no longer just remembering her. He He was starting to question the lie that stole them both apart. Ethan could not stop thinking about the silver star tie clip. The moment he returned to his penthouse that night, he unlocked the black safe near his office again and pulled out the faded childhood photograph with trembling hands. There it was. 8-year-old Ethan standing beside his mother outside their Brooklyn apartment, smiling nervously in a tiny navy blue suit. Attached to his crooked tie was the same silver star clip now sitting inside Ethan's jacket pocket. His chest tightened painfully. There was no possible explanation anymore. The old janitor knew things she should not know. She had his childhood tie clip. She hummed his mother's lullaby. She used the exact phrases his mother once whispered during storms. Ethan stared out across the dark Manhattan skyline, while memories he had buried for decades slowly clawed their way back to the surface. But another thought disturbed him even more. Victor's reaction. The fear in Margaret's eyes the moment Victor appeared outside the office had not looked accidental. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Cole Dynamics earlier than usual. The building lobby buzzed with preparations for the annual company gala scheduled that evening. Employees carried floral arrangements across polished marble floors, while event planners hurried through the elevators balancing trays of decorations and lighting. Equipment. Ethan ignored all of it. He walked directly toward the executive archives office and shut the door behind him. For the next 2 hours, he searched through sealed company records connected to his late father, Richard Cole. Old financial disputes, divorce filings, legal settlements. Most files had already been digitized years ago, but one missing folder caught his attention immediately. Margaret Cole. Removed from archive access 27 years earlier by executive authorization signed personally by Victor Hale. Ethan stared at the screen in disbelief. Victor had worked for his father long before becoming chief financial officer. Why would he erase records connected to Ethan's mother? Ethan immediately picked up his phone. Get me Victor. Now. 20 minutes later, Victor entered Ethan's office with his usual composed expression, though tension lingered beneath his calm eyes. You wanted to see me? Ethan tossed a printed document across the desk. Why was my mother's file removed from company archives? Victor's expression barely changed. Old legal complications, he answered smoothly. Your father handled those matters privately. Ethan stood slowly from behind the desk. What matters? Victor adjusted his cufflinks carefully before responding. Your mother left, Ethan. Your father wanted the situation buried to protect the family reputation. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then why are you the one who erased the records? For the first time, Victor hesitated. Only for a second. But Ethan noticed. Your father asked me to, Victor replied quietly. You were a child. He believed forgetting her was healthier for you. Ethan looked away toward the city windows, anger and confusion twisting violently inside him now. For years he had accepted the story without question. His mother abandoned him. End of discussion. But suddenly the pieces no longer fit together. Not with the old janitor's tears. Not with the lullaby. Not with the silver star clip she somehow protected for decades. That evening, the grand ballroom inside Cole Dynamics glittered beneath crystal chandeliers as New York's wealthiest executives filled the annual gala in tuxedos and designer gowns. Waiters carried champagne through crowds of investors, while photographers captured every polished smile. Ethan stood near the stage preparing for his speech, but his attention kept drifting across the room, searching for one person only. Then he saw her. Margaret quietly replacing empty glasses near the back wall in her janitor uniform while trying to remain invisible among the luxury surrounding her. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded ballroom. And for the first time in 30 years, Ethan no longer looked at her like a stranger. He looked at her like a question. The ballroom shimmered beneath enormous crystal chandeliers, while cameras flashed across polished marble floors. Soft jazz drifted through the air as New York's wealthiest investors laughed beside towers of champagne glasses and million-dollar conversations. Everything looked elegant, perfect, but Ethan barely heard any of it. From the stage near the center of the ballroom, he stood holding his prepared speech while his eyes searched only for Margaret near the back wall. She moved quietly between tables collecting empty glasses, trying to disappear beneath the glow of luxury surrounding her. Yet now Ethan noticed every detail. The slight limp in her step after long shifts. The careful way she avoided interrupting anyone. The exhaustion hidden beneath her gentle smile. Suddenly, none of the billionaires in the room looked impressive to him anymore. Victor approached the stage with his usual polished confidence and adjusted his tuxedo cuffs smoothly. "The investors from San Francisco are ready for your announcement," he said quietly. Ethan nodded absently, though his attention never fully left Margaret across the room. Victor followed his gaze and immediately stiffened. "She should not be working tonight," he muttered coldly. Ethan looked at him sharply. "Why?" Victor forced a tight smile. "This event is for executives and partners. It reflects badly when maintenance staff wander through guest areas." Ethan frowned slightly. "She works here." Victor lowered his voice further. "People like her should remain invisible at events like this." The sentence hit Ethan harder than expected. Invisible. He glanced back toward Margaret, watching her quietly wipe water rings from a table while wealthy strangers ignored her existence completely. Something twisted painfully in his chest. Before Ethan could respond, one of the waiters accidentally bumped into Margaret near the center aisle. A tray tilted sideways, sending several champagne glasses crashing onto the marble floor. The ballroom instantly fell silent. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Margaret froze in embarrassment as shattered glass scattered around her shoes. "I am so sorry," she whispered immediately, kneeling down to clean the mess with trembling hands. Victor stepped forward first, his face darkening with irritation. "This is exactly why staff should stay out of executive events," he snapped sharply enough for nearby guests to hear. Margaret lowered her head further, humiliated beneath hundreds of watching eyes. "I can clean it," she whispered softly. Victor's expression remained cold. "No, you are done here. Collect your things tonight." Ethan stared at Victor in disbelief. "You are firing her over broken glasses?" Victor leaned closer. "She has become a distraction." The word echoed painfully in Ethan's mind. Distraction. Suddenly memories crashed together all at once. The lullaby. The tie clip. The way she knew his storms, his headaches, his habits. The tears in her eyes every time he spoke kindly to her. And then one final memory surfaced from somewhere deep inside him. 8-year-old Ethan crying after dropping a glass in their tiny kitchen while his mother knelt beside him saying softly, "People matter more than mistakes." Ethan looked at Margaret kneeling alone on the ballroom floor surrounded by broken glass, while wealthy strangers watched her like she was nothing. Something inside him finally broke. Enough. The entire ballroom turned toward Ethan's voice instantly. He stepped down from the stage slowly, his polished shoes crossing the marble floor until he stood directly beside Margaret. Without hesitation, Ethan knelt beside her and gently took the cleaning towel from her shaking hands. Gasps spread quietly through the crowd. Victor stared in disbelief. Ethan looked directly at Margaret now. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan reached into his pocket and slowly placed the tiny silver star tie clip into her palm. Margaret's breath caught instantly. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. Ethan's own voice trembled slightly as he finally whispered the question haunting him for days. "Who are you really?" Margaret looked at him through tears shining beneath the chandelier lights. Her lips parted softly. "I never stopped being your mother." The ballroom remained completely silent after Margaret's words. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead while hundreds of wealthy guests stood frozen in place, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Ethan stayed kneeling beside her on the marble floor, staring into the tear-filled eyes he had unknowingly passed every day for 3 years. His breathing felt uneven again, but this time it had nothing to do with panic. It was grief. Shock. 30 years of anger collapsing all at once beneath the weight of a single truth. "No," Ethan whispered weakly, almost like a child refusing heartbreak. "My mother left me." Margaret shook her head slowly as tears slipped down her cheeks. "I tried to come back for you," she whispered. "I never stopped trying." Ethan looked toward Victor instantly. The older man's face had gone pale beneath the ballroom lights. "Tell me she is lying," Ethan demanded quietly. Victor remained silent too long. And in that silence, Ethan understood everything. The missing files, the erased records, the fear in Margaret's eyes whenever Victor appeared. Victor finally exhaled heavily and loosened his jaw. "Your father believed she would ruin the company," he admitted carefully. "The divorce scandal was already destroying investor confidence. When she fought for custody, your father paid lawyers to bury her financially." Margaret lowered her eyes painfully. "I lost everything," she whispered. The apartment. The court case. Even visitation. Ethan stared at Victor in disbelief. And you helped him? Victor avoided his eyes. I protected the company. Ethan slowly stood to his feet, rage and heartbreak colliding inside him. But when he looked back at Margaret, kneeling beside broken glass in her janitor uniform, the anger disappeared beneath something far heavier. Guilt. Crushing guilt. For years he had hated her, blamed her, forgotten her, while she quietly cleaned the floors beneath his empire just to remain close to him. Ethan suddenly reached down and helped her stand gently before turning toward the entire ballroom. His voice remained calm now, but it carried through the silent room with painful clarity. The woman standing beside me worked in this building for 3 years while every person here ignored her. He paused, looking directly at the executives surrounding him, including me. Margaret shook her head softly. Ethan, please. But Ethan continued anyway. You all see billion-dollar deals and headlines when you look at me. But the strongest person in this room is not wearing a tuxedo tonight. His eyes filled as he looked at Margaret again. It is the woman who lost everything and still spent 30 years loving a son who believed she abandoned him. Across the ballroom, several guests quietly lowered their eyes in shame. Ethan turned back toward Victor one final time. You are finished here. Victor opened his mouth slightly, but Ethan cut him off. Effective immediately. Security approached silently as Victor stood motionless beneath the chandeliers, finally realizing the power he spent decades protecting had vanished in a single night. But Ethan no longer cared about any of it. Not the investors. Not the cameras. Not the gala. He looked only at Margaret now. Slowly, carefully, Ethan stepped closer until his forehead rested gently against hers. His voice cracked completely when he finally whispered the word he had not spoken in 30 years. Mom. Margaret broke down instantly, covering her mouth as tears shook through her entire body. Ethan wrapped his arms around her carefully while the ballroom faded into silence around them. 6 months later, the top floor of Cole Dynamics no longer held executive offices. Ethan transformed the entire space into the Maggie Cole Foundation, providing housing assistance and job programs for older workers forgotten by society. The first framed object hanging near the entrance was not a business award or magazine cover. It was a tiny silver star tie clipped beside a handwritten plaque that read, "Lucky stars protect brave boys." Every Friday night, long after the employees went home, Ethan and Margaret stayed behind together in the foundation kitchen, sharing grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, while rain tapped softly against the Manhattan windows. And sometimes, when thunderstorms rolled across the city, Margaret still hummed the old lullaby quietly beneath her breath, while Ethan listened like the little boy who had finally found his way home.